Hello there. It is a wonderfully rainy day here in Alabama, and I have the pretty mug this week. This week, we're taking a look at one of the most common complaints about Shakespeare, the idea that Shakespeare plagiarized. You can look at his plays and the text of his plays, and you can tell that he copied from works that were either contemporary to his or from the past. So this week, we're asking the question, did Shakespeare plagiarize? Plagiarism as a concept is a modern thing. It didn't really exist in terms of copyright law until the late 18th century and well into the 19th century. But the word itself got its start with one of Shakespeare's contemporaries. The word plagiary is credited to Ben Jonson, who used it perhaps because of his run-ins with Shakespeare. We don't know. But the word itself got its start in about 1601. But the thing you have to know about Shakespeare is that during his lifetime, copyright laws weren't the same as they are today, and people weren't as concerned with plagiarism as they are today. The entire concept of plagiarism goes all the way back to the first century AD. There were records of Romans that were fighting over plagiarism. There's a man named Martial who fussed at his fellow Roman named Fendetus, and he said, "Oh my gosh, you stole my work. If you're going to use my poems and walk around telling people that they're yours, you need to pay them for me." Which you can understand because today we go and buy images on places like Shutterstock. And once we pay for them, we're allowed to use them on our website and call them ours. That is an old concept of I'm willing to let you use my art if you pay me for it. And so this idea of plagiarism and copyright law and who owns what I produce and how much can I borrow before it starts to be stealing has been a long and drawn out conversation. And Shakespeare had this conversation going on in his life too. You'll remember that Robert Greene called Shakespeare out as being fluffed up with the feathers of his contemporaries. Robert Greene said it more beautifully than I did. See, I can't even say beautifully. But anyway, in his speech, The Groat's Worth of Wit, you should go and look at that. He was about to die, and he basically railed on everybody in this document and said, these things can't go unsaid before I die. And he fussed at Shakespeare for stealing other people's works. Personally, it reads to me like a man who was jealous of another man's success, but you can go and read it and decide what you think. Well, here's how a basic timeline of things went down. In about 1530, which is a good 34 years before Shakespeare was born, there's this royal declaration that requires approval before you can publish something. You have to get what was called pre-publication approval, and then you also have to get post-publication registration of every book that got printed in England. So this was kind of a way of both censoring it and staking a claim to what was written. By 1557, which is less than a decade before Shakespeare was born, Queen Mary granted a charter to the Stationers Company, which basically said you have to register things that get printed. And once the printer or publisher got the manuscript and the licenses that were required, he could register a copy of the printed book, which means now the Stationers Register has exclusive rights to reproduce this text. Now, there was no such right for the author of whatever text it was. So once the Stationers Register owned a copy of the text, the author had relinquished their rights to it. This was the law that required Shakespeare's plays to be registered. So when you study Shakespeare and you look at Shakespeare in history, a lot of times authors and historians will tell you about the timeline of when Shakespeare's plays were written based on the records that we have from the Stationers Register. And they'll say, well, if you look at a timeline of Shakespeare's plays, for example, they'll say, oh, well, The Tempest was registered in this year. And that's what they're talking about. The play had to be registered at the Stationers Register before it could be printed and reproduced. Now, one thing that's really interesting, and one of the reasons I think Shakespeare should be considered a dramatist as opposed to being considered a writer, is because from about 1580 until 1620, which almost directly coincides with exactly when Shakespeare was writing in London. Remember, he died in 1616, but we have records placing him as starting writing in London around 1590. Some historians even go back into the 1580s and say, no, he was writing before that. So it's very, very close to exactly the time period when Shakespeare was producing his works in London. And during that time, the rights for performers and playwrights were completely different from the Stationers Register. A theater company owns the exclusive rights to perform a play written by one of its members. Though companies might have several different plays that were all based on historical events, or that were similar to each other. Like for Shakespeare, Hamlet, King Lear, the Richards, and Falstaff, these are all interrelating and have lots of similarities. When you study Shakespeare, you'll learn that there are a lot of latitude. Now, when you study Shakespeare, there's a lot of latitude as to what actually happens on stage when the play is performed that doesn't always show up in the text itself. For example, in Richard II, George Plantagenet dies. And exactly how he dies is left largely open to interpretation. There's dialogue in the text of the play that suggests he's stabbed, but there's stage directions that suggest he might have been drowned in a butt of Malmsey. And there's no stage direction or dialogue that explains what the fight is going to look like when the murderers come in to murder George Plantagenet. So the director and the performers have an enormous amount of latitude on stage. Does George Plantagenet fight fiercely, or is he too weak from imprisonment? There's a lot of things that you don't know about this story. And to me, it seems logical that Shakespeare would have set this up this way on purpose. Because once he's taken the text and he's given it to the Stationer's Register, he's relinquished his authorship rights to it. They can print it, other people can borrow what's written down, and the written part of his work is now available in a way that's much more closely tied to what we think of as public domain material today than it would be considered personal property. Once it's written down and it's out there, other people can borrow it. But Shakespeare was protecting himself by not putting everything in the text. He is providing a lot of stuff that goes on stage. So what we don't know about Richard II is how Shakespeare would have staged that scene. And even when I was talking to an expert in original practice on how they staged this particular play, he was telling me that one of the beautiful things about Shakespeare and performing it using original techniques and approaches is that there is a lot of room for improvisation on stage. And so even with the acting companies, when they perform Shakespeare's plays, every single performance is an original, because you get up there and you're performing it and you're improvising these fight scenes. And so George Plantagenet might stab him overhand, or get stabbed overhand in one scene, or he might be drug off and drowned in the butt of Malmsey in the second production, and they get to decide how they're going to do this as they're going. So it's very, very fluid. And Shakespeare might have done that on purpose because he didn't want people to steal that part. When people would come into the theater, they didn't know ahead of time how George Plantagenet was going to die. They had to come to the theater and sit down and find it out there that night. They had to pay the ticket price to find out exactly what went on stage, because the text never revealed that. And I think some of these copyright laws and understanding of public domain material and what happens to your work once you printed it and put it out there was something Shakespeare was really conscious of, and he built that into how he designed his plays. So when you are studying Shakespeare's plays in context of understanding some of the copyright laws or lack of copyright laws that existed when he was writing and producing his plays, you also start to see that Shakespeare may have intentionally left out key plot details so that even someone who was copying his text verbatim would not be able to truly copy a Shakespeare play. For modern performances, this means that you get a wide range of adaptations and people who can come in and say, well, I think it should be staged this way, or I think we should stage it that way. And they all get to be considered Shakespearean because Shakespeare himself left it open to this interpretation. Copyright laws in general would go through a massive evolution over the next several hundred years, with the copyright first belonging to the publisher and then to the author through the 18th century. And then by the 19th century, it would switch and belong mostly to the author for most of that century. By the 20th century, copyright laws had evolved to the point where the public domain had shrunk and it was quite small. And actually the copyright setup would revert back to be very similar to what was going on with royal patents in the 16th and 17th century, in the sense that there was this perpetual copyright belonging to the Stationer's Register. So what does this mean for Shakespeare's artistry? Was he a real writer if he plagiarized? T.S. Eliot is quoted as saying, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. And this is echoed throughout history. We know that Milton stole material from Masanias. Later, Lawrence Sterne stole material from Robert Burton. Samuel Coleridge stole from Schelling. And J.R.R. Tolkien borrowed heavily from Norse sagas and tales that had been written. Virgil was once quoted as saying, well, I just picked the pearls out of his dunghill. You know, the idea that, well, most of his work was poop and I'm picking out the pearls, right? I'm picking out the good stuff. And so my work is all pearls would be the idea. Well, so there's this massive history of writers and playwrights and artists who borrow material. Shakespeare borrowed heavily from past works, even going so far as to quote particular sections verbatim. There are sections of plays where, you know, speeches that different characters give that are exact replicas of other written works. And it's been all in the news recently that there's this new software out that analyzed Shakespeare's texts and found that Shakespeare was a plagiarist. Oh my gosh, this is what the headlines read and everybody's freaking out. And you look at, well, what does that mean? How did they find out that he was a plagiarist? Well, from an article in The Independent, they're quoted as saying, taking one example of a similar passage in Shakespeare's writing, the Duke of Gloucester's opening monologue in Richard III, the scholars found the software detected a tight juxtaposition of the same 8 terms: glass, proportion, fair, feature, deformed, world, shadow, and nature. So there's 8 words that Shakespeare used that other people have also used, and this is how they think he's a plagiarist. I don't really buy that. How are you supposed to write something and not use the same words as someone else is using if you and that author are writing in the same language? Oh my gosh, to me that seems ridiculous. Like, oh, okay, well, to be a real playwright, you can't use words that other people have used. So what does that mean exactly? Now he has to create his own lexicon. He's got to invent a language before he can write and be truly considered an artist, because if he uses a word someone else has used, well, now he's a plagiarist. You know, where does that line get drawn exactly? When we discuss Shakespeare and plagiarism, are we going to decide that, oh, well, let's discredit him for being a plagiarist? Or are we going to acknowledge that being an artist doesn't happen in a vacuum? Being an artist myself, I am going to say very much the latter. Art isn't about not copying someone. As T.S. Eliot, and even if you want to reference someone more modern, Jeff Goins recently published a book called Great Artists Steal. Austin Kleon put out a book called Steal Like an Artist. I think the idea of being influenced by other writers or having their work influence what you're doing, or borrowing some of the things that they did well and doing that too because it's done well, is the very idea of being an artist. Now, I'll draw the distinction for the strict definition of plagiarism that everybody thinks of, right? Okay, you're sitting in a college classroom or even your high school English classroom, and your English teacher is standing up there wagging her finger at you or his finger at you, telling you that, oh, you can't plagiarize. It is the devil. You can't plagiarize. And they define this as, well, you've been assigned to write a paper, and you go to Wikipedia, you copy and paste 5 pages of Wikipedia into a Word document, slap your name at the top, and walk up to the desk and say, hi, I wrote a paper. You know, that's not art, that's laziness. Plagiarism in that sense isn't wrong because you copied from a fellow artist. It's wrong because you didn't do any work at all. You know, you didn't copy someone else's work. And, you know, that's not why it's wrong. You didn't do any work. I think when you look at people like T.S. Eliot or Virgil, who is picking the pearls out of Ennius's work, he wasn't copy-pasting Ennius's work and saying, this is now by Virgil. He went and took the pieces that he thought were beautiful and turned them into his version of a story. And Shakespeare does the same thing. He doesn't copy and paste some old Roman drama and call it his. He goes back to those stories and uses them as prompts, as writing prompts, as story prompts. Like, oh, this was beautiful. It needs to be retold. I'm going to bring it into my story and use it as part of that. You know, to get mad about that is pretty kindergartenish. Like, you're sitting down at a table and you know, the whole class has been assigned to paint a blue elephant, and you get mad because your neighbor is also painting a blue elephant. You're like, okay, you can hold up everyone's blue elephant and see that they are unique in a classroom full of paintings. It's one of the things I love about going and teaching painting classes. I go to a library and I'll teach a painting class for people who have never painted before. And they all get in there and we teach them acrylics, and we all paint the same painting because it's easier to teach everybody the techniques and the processes of using acrylic paint if they're all painting the same flower pot, right? So we paint this flower pot. When you get done, everybody in the class, we take a picture with everybody holding their picture. And the most fascinating part is we have all sat there and painted the same painting. But when you stand them up side by side, everybody's work is not just a little bit different, massively different from one artist to the next, even though at face value, they have all painted the same picture. And I think the frustration over plagiarism is a lot of the same thing. You know, sure, maybe Shakespeare sat down and used the same colors as Plato. You know, maybe he even painted the same flower pot that Plato painted, but the way Plato painted it and the way Shakespeare painted it are drastically different. And that's what makes them artists, is you cannot copy someone else's genius. You cannot copy someone else's artistry. You can't be someone else. You can only be you. So your work is original because it's yours. Shakespeare's work was original because it was his, because no one else is going to be able to help create or create independently a play and put into it that Shakespeare thing that Shakespeare put into it. If words are colors, we all paint with the same rainbow. And just because Shakespeare colored a picture of a giraffe and it was prettier or more popular than Robert Greene's picture of a giraffe doesn't mean that Robert Greene gets to stand up and say, "Nuh-uh, I did it first." You know, that's silly. Popularity is fickle, and history is even more so. So just because you're reading about Shakespeare being famous today doesn't mean that the contemporary writers that were writing along with him don't matter. He was truly a great artist, but like any artist, he wasn't operating in a vacuum or in some kind of creative hole where he ate pencils and then vomited brilliance onto the stage. He was great because of what was around him, because of what was influencing him, the books that he read and the thoughts that were speaking into his mind. He was a great reader, and he had great thoughts to work with because of this. And just like a great painter is made even more great for having good tools to work with, Shakespeare's investment in reading and learning and knowledge allowed him to produce work that had a lasting popularity. So to answer this week's question, the idea was, did Shakespeare plagiarize? Yes, by strict definition, I think he would get kicked out of any college classroom. But does that make him less of an artist? Certainly not. I think anyone that discredits Shakespeare's success because they think he plagiarized is either jealous of his success and they want to bring him down a notch so that they feel like his level of success is just that much more accessible for them, which is pathetic, by the way, or they just don't have anything better to do with their time. Now, that said, I personally find Shakespeare's source material to be really interesting, not to mention kind of a place to discover your next reading list. I've got Sophocles on my reading list for this year because of Shakespeare, because Sophocles and Plato were source material for Shakespeare. I'm now going and exploring those writings too, because if Shakespeare found that interesting and found something in it that could feed his artistry, maybe it can feed my artistry too. And so it's like Shakespeare gave me a book recommendation. Isn't that awesome? So his source material is really fascinating to explore, but this is another example of why studying Shakespeare's plays in context of his life is so important. When you read his plays like they're books, which they aren't, if you pick them up and you read through them as a text only, the way you're taught in an English department to look at a text as, you know, seal off everything else and look only at the words on the page. If you do that to Shakespeare, you're really doing him a disservice, because you'll see that he used the same words as a previous author, and you'll count yourself so brilliant that you discovered this unique thing, and you'll want to apply 21st century definitions of plagiarism to Shakespeare, and it's not fair. He didn't have those rules or cultural qualms when he was producing his works. And so when you look at Shakespeare and you look at his plays, you have to look at it in terms of his culture and his life, or you're not really learning Shakespeare. That'll do it for this week. I'm Casta Cash, that Shakespeare girl. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. I love to see those like buttons and that you guys got something out of this video. Please join me next week. I'll be back next Saturday with a new video asking a new question about did Shakespeare. Don't forget to subscribe to the email list. I send out all of the good stuff, including freebies and first in line things for new products and announcements to people on the email list. So if you want to join a Shakespeare community, we talk a lot about Shakespeare each week, and you learn great things. So come and join us over there, castycash.com. There is a guide to my top 10 favorite Shakespeare insults available on castycash.com right now. You can go over there and grab your copy of that. Until next week, I'm Casty Cash, and I'll see you guys next Saturday.